All right, I will say good morning, a good chodesh, everyone. Let us begin by thanking all of our sponsors. To thank our Talmud Torah sponsors. Still for the month of Nisan, they get one more day. Paul and Kathy Pollack for dedicating all the Shumer Drashos this month in memory of Paul's parents, Shmuel ben Zechariah and Sarah Bas Avraham. And to thank Avram and Shane D. Kelman for dedicating all the Shumer Drashos this month in memory of Avram's mother, Sarah Braina Bas Yoshua Heschel, Zichron Livrach. We hope that in the merits of our Talmud Torah, all of the neshamas will have an aliyah and the families a nechama. And also with that, let us begin. So we have a lot to do today. Today's daf is Chaf Gimel 23. We are picking up in Meretz Hashem on Chaf Beis Amud Beis, 17 lines up from the bottom, right before the Mishnah. Amalei Yanai Malka L'Dvisu. So King Yanai said to his wife. Now we'll say King Yanai was one of the last Hashmonai kings. Remember again, after the Hanukkah story, so an interesting dynamic occurred, which was the Hashmonaim, who themselves were Kohanim, went ahead and assumed not only the Kohanic role, but also assumed the monarchy within Klal Yisrael. So that didn't exactly work out very well for the Kohanim, for the Chashmonaim, for a variety of reasons. In any event, Yanai himself was an interesting individual because he becomes a Tzeduki, right? He becomes part of the sect. Tzedukim, remember again, didn't believe in Chazal, didn't believe in Torah Shebal Peh. So, Amar Yanai Makal Dvisu. This is an incredible idea over here. Yanai said to his wife, Al Tisray Min Prushim, so don't go ahead and be afraid from Prushim. The Prushim were the regular Jewish community. In other words, those individuals who believed in Torah Shebal Peh, regular good Jews. So don't be afraid of the Prushim. Now look at Rashi just a moment. Al tisar min Prushim, Prushim hayu sonin oso. The Prushim hated Yanai. Now why do they hate Yanai? Lefisha harag min hachachamim harbe v'nepach lios tzeduki. Because as we said before, so Yanai himself first of all murdered a number of the Rabbanim, and he himself became a tzeduki, right? Became one of this sect, one of these individuals who did not believe in Torah Shebal Peh anymore. So what happened? The Kidar Mikidushin Kishemeis Haise Ishto Yireya Mehenshel Ya'avira Hamalucha Mibaneha. So ultimately, again, as Yanai was dying, his wife was afraid that when he died, the rabbis would remove the monarchy from Yanai's children, right? Because remember again, as a reprisal, as a repercussion, as a punishment for what Yanai did, so that they would remove the monarchy from his kids. So he says to her, this is the conversation he's having with her as he's dying. So Yanai says to his wife, don't be afraid of the Prushim. Right? Again, remember again, Prushim are the regular Jews. Don't be afraid of them. Why? He says, Yanai says, because at the end of the day, the sins of the father are not visited upon the son. In other words, I did what I did, but our children really, are carrying out their own path. And he says, also don't be afraid of the people who aren't Prushim. Now, who are the people who aren't Prushim? They're Tzedukim, right? So don't be afraid of the Tzedukim, right? The Tzedukim, why not? Because we're one of them, I'm one of them. So you have nothing to be afraid of from the Prushim, nothing to be afraid of from the Tzedukim. So who should you be afraid of? He says, Ela minat tzivuin. So I will say that tzivuin, he says, what's this? Shedoma the Prushim, shemaseni k'maise zimri, or mevakshin schar kepinchas. So it's incredible. Yana said, who do you have to be afraid of? You have to be afraid of the tzivuin. I will say that tzivuin literally means someone who's colored. Rashi says, she'ein mar'isam kitoldos sam el tzivuin mibachutz. Those words mean they're colored. In other words, it's kind of like the chameleon, right? So the chameleon, right, shifts colors to blend in wherever it is. So the tzivuin is also someone who's a disingenuous individual. Literally, again, that Lashon uses over here is Shemasei K'maise Zimri. Let's say, remember again, Zimri was one of the individuals who engaged in immorality. This is the story of Pinchas, right? When Pinchas, right there, there was this immorality with the Midianite women. So Zimri was one of the ringleaders in immorality. So they act like Zimri, but they want schar, they want reward like Pinchas. Such a good phrase. Masin Kemai says Zimri, they act like Zimri, but they want reward as if they were pious like Pinchas. So it's fascinating. So here Yanai says to his wife, those are the people you have to watch out for, right? In other words, people, right, the Prushim who are good people, okay, don't worry about them. Don't worry about them. They're not going to take revenge on you. The Tzdukin, again, it's Landsman, right? We're one of, or I'm one of them. You have nothing to fear from them. Who do you have to fear from? I was saying, disingenuous people. And by the way, it's true in general in life. You see, a person could be a good person, could be a bad person, as long as they're genuine in who and what they are, and kind of what we call toho kibaro. The inside is like the outside. You can deal and navigate with an individual. The most difficult people to interact with are the people whom you don't really know what they're doing or who they are. There's just a certain level of disingenuousness in them that you can't exactly tell who is it that you're dealing with. Says Yanai, those are the people, unfortunately, you have to look out for. Profound. Good. Mishnah. Rabbi Shimon says, Ein schus tol b'mayim amarim. Rabbi Shimon disagrees with what we said before, namely, he holds that a schus cannot stave off the effects of the water. In other words, we were speaking about before that you could have a situation of a woman who is a sotah, who is an adulteress, right? And lemaisa, again, because of some zechus, some merit that she possesses, ultimately, again, it could stave off the effects of the water. Shimon says, no, that concept does not apply. And I'll tell you why. Because if you say that some type of schos, some type of merit staves off the effects of the water, ultimately, we'll say, so mata literally means you're going to go ahead and literally push off or dilute. He changes it over here. Right? Machshich. In other words, you diminish the impact of the water in the eyes of all of those who drink it. Or more importantly, umotzi ata shemra ala tahoro sheshasu. Now let's say, what you also do is you totally erode the impact of water. The whole chap of the Sotah waters is what? Instantaneous judgment. That in other words, you could tell right now who is guilty and who is innocent. Who is guilty and who is innocent. So it says the Gemara, so what's going to happen? Sha'omrim Timeos hein, ela shatal lahen schus. So Rabbi Shimon says, because what's going to happen? What's going to happen? Can you imagine the scene? A woman's going to come to the Beis HaMikdash. She's going to go ahead and drink the waters, and nothing's going to happen. Nothing's going to happen. So both say, and now what are people going to say? You know, she's guilty. She's guilty. But Baruch Hashem, you know what, whatever, she does Tomchei Shabbos, you know, or whatever, you know, she bakes challah for the poor, or she learns Torah. In other words, you're going to totally mess up the system. So suddenly, again, I will say what it does is, see, we're not as much worried about the women who are, we are worried about the women who are guilty, but more importantly, what it does is it casts a pall upon the women who are innocent. And suddenly, again, every single woman who's innocent who walks out unscathed, she's not really innocent, quote unquote. She's just, her punishment is just held in abeyance. To which the Gemara says, well, so therefore, Rabbi Shimon rejects this notion that a schus could go ahead and delay the effects of the water. So the Gemara says, Rabbi says, no, haschus tola. Rabbi says, no, I disagree. The schus, right, a merit can stave off the effects of the water. So we'll say, well, watch this. However, we'll say, watch this. And this helps to clarify. Many of you raised Rabbi Shimon's issue, right? That I don't understand. If a schus works for her, you've totally undone the system. So Rebbe comes up with an interesting compromise model. Rebbe says, Rebbe Omer, has schus told my mar. No, it's not true. Well, as we said before, a schus, a merit, can help, right, can hold the effects of the water, can delay the effects of the water. So what happens? Watch this. But right after she drinks it, if she is pregnant, if she is guilty, Eina Yoledes, she will no longer give birth. Ve'eina Mishabachas. I will say Eina Mishabachas means she no longer continues to physically thrive. So what happens? Ella, Misnavna V'holachas. She begins already, Misnavna means she begins to go ahead and I don't want to use the word decay, because that's a word. Something means she begins to diminish, we'll call it. Diminish, right? And what happens? And at the end of the day, when she dies, which happens not too long, not too far off. Again, it could be delayed a year or two or even three maybe, but Lamaisa, again, there's a process of diminution that already begins at the time that she drinks. And when she dies, she meets with the same death that a Sotah normally would. So I will say, so this is an interesting position. So essentially what you have over here is the previous Mishnah, which doesn't seem to make any distinction. Now literally, Schus Tolala sounds like the effects of the water are delayed in totality. You have Rabbi Shimon, therefore again, who rejects this notion of Schus Tolala. He says, no, Schus is not Tolala. If you're guilty, the waters check you then and there, and there is no zechus that staves off the effect. And then Rebbe. And Rebbe, since he had this compromised position, Rebbe holds that Allah Chalamaisa, the aschos could go ahead and delay the instantaneous death. But the process of what we'll call it physical degradation already begins now. Already begins now. And I will say not only that, already begins in a physically realizable fashion. So that's easy according to Rebbe is that you could tell the guilt or the innocence of a Sotah instantaneously. It's just sometimes because of a schus, the actual death penalty itself could be delayed. Incredible. So it says, the Gemara goes weiter. The Gemara says, good. Nitmeis mincha sa'at shel kitchevikli. So we'll say we're transitioning now to the discussion about her karban mincha. If her mincha becomes Tmeya. Now, I'll say, so again, this is talking about, we saw before, remember the process for the mincha? What's the process? Step one, it's brought to the Beis HaMikdash in a kli that could be a kli sharis, right? It's not a kli sharis, but it could be a kli sharis. So we're talking about over here now, where let's say her karban mincha becomes tameh before it was put into a kli sharis. So what's the halacha? So nitmeis mincha zachlo kitchebekli hare, excuse me, harehi kichola menachos v'tipada. Ultimately, again, it's like every other mincha, and it could be redeemed. Fine. So we'll say this before it's put into the kli sharis. What happens if the mincha becomes tameh after the mincha was put into a kli sharis? Then what? What's the halacha? So harehi kichol hamenachos v'tisarif. So we'll say in that case, a karban mincha, which has been sanctified in a kli sharis and subsequently becomes tameh, ultimately is burnt. Okay. Ve'elu sheminchoseihen nisrafos. And we'll say now here's a full list of everyone whose mincha is burned. Top of Chav Gimel. Homeres Timei ani lecha. Well, some interesting cases here. A woman says to her husband, I committed adultery. And I will say, this would be a case where let's say again, remember, let's say the karban mincha was already put into a kli sharis. And afterwards, again, she says, I'm Tameya. So we'll say in that case, obviously we wouldn't offer up the mincha anymore. Rather, we'd go ahead and burn her mincha. Or we'll say burn her mincha, by the way, usually means like on the Beis Hadesh, like on the ash pile. We'd go ahead and we burn her mincha nisrafas. Right? Shabala edim she Tameya, or witnesses show up and say that she is Tameya. So this is all assuming, again, the witnesses are showing up when? Right? After the mincha has already been consecrated. Va'omeres eni shosa, or a woman says, I'm not drinking. So let's say, remember again, if she says eno shosa, so again, that shuts down the process as well. We burn her mincha. V'shabayla eno rotzelash gosa. So we'll say, we haven't spoken about this case yet, but we will. Intriguing case where, let's say, you could have a situation where the husband brings his wife to the Beis HaMikdash for the Sotah process, and then what? He has a change of heart. He says, I don't want to do this. So again, we'll see the ramifications of that if he chooses to shut down the process. But one thing we do know is if he says, I am not having her drink, ultimately, again, we burn her mincha. Next, v'shabayla ba'ala baderech, or her husband has relations with her on the way to the Beis HaMikdash. Again, we'll discuss that case as well. Fine. So those are all the Sotah cases in which a mincha would be burnt. We'll say, so now a separate halacha. So we'll say in general, again, we'll discuss this halacha. any woman who is married to a Kohen and has to bring a mincha, I will say this is not to a Sotah. I mean, it could be Sotah, but it doesn't have to be Sotah, right? If a woman is married to a Kohen and she has to bring a karban mincha, what's the halacha? Minchosehen nisrafos. I will say, just to explain what that means. Now, what that means is the mincha is offered. Remember again, which part of a mincha is offered? Which part of mincha is offered? Kmitza. Now remember again, mincha 101. What happens to the karban mincha? You offer up a kmitza. What happens with the rest of the karban? Given to the kohanim. They were going to see there's a unique halacha that either when a kohen himself has to offer up a mincha, or when the wife of a kohen has to offer up a mincha, the kometz is offered, but the rest of the mincha is not consumed by the kohanim. Instead, what happens to it? The rest of the mincha is burned on the mizbeach as well. So we'll see that's a unique halacha. So that's what it means over here. Kol nesuos lakohanim. If a woman is married to a kohen, and ultimately, again, she is bringing a karban mincha, minchosehen nisrafos. Her mincha is burned. Basi Yisrael sheni says lakohen. If you have a Basi Yisrael that's married to a kohen, Basi Yisrael sheni says lakohen. So again, there's a regular Jewish woman who's now married to a kohen. Minchasa nisrafes. I will say again, that's just the same application of a previous halacha. Kohenes sheni says Yisrael. On the other hand, I will say if you have a Bas Kohen who marries Yisrael, minchasa ne'achelas. Ultimately, I will say then she can bring a karban mincha, and her karban mincha is treated like the karban mincha of any other Yisrael. Okay? Ma ben kohen lekohenes. I will say now, third topic in the Mishnah. Was there a kohen and a kohenes? Interesting case. Minchas kohenes ne'achelas. So first of all, I'll say, so remember, a kohenes is a Bas Kohen who marries a Yisrael. So if a Bas Kohen marries a Yisrael, and she brings a mincha, that is a regular mincha. But the mincha of a kohen ultimately is not consumed, rather is burned on the mizbeach. Next, kohenes mischalalas, the kohen ein mischalal. So I will say this is an interesting case. A kohenes could forever become disqualified from the kahuna, but ultimately, again, a kohen cannot. Now, what I'm going to say, just to illustrate this, as Rashi illustrates it. Rashi says, for example, let's say a woman, right, a kohenes, goes ahead and has relations with someone with whom she is not allowed to marry, right? So I will say, that makes her a chalala, and if she becomes a chalala, she can never again be part of the kuna, marry into the kuna. It's different than a kohen. I will say, let's say a kohen, right? A kohen's not allowed to marry a divorcee. No kohen is allowed to. Let's say a kohen marries a grusha. So I'll say, what's the halacha when he marries a grusha? What's the halacha? While he's married to her, he's disqualified from his kahuna. Once he goes out and divorces her, what happens? Restored to his previous status. So what it's just pointing out over here is that a woman could become permanently disqualified from the kahuna. A man, a kohen, who does the wrong thing, ultimately is disqualified as long as he's actively engaged in the bad behavior, but ultimately, again, then could become reinstituted into the kahuna. Quite interesting. So the Gemara goes right. The Gemara says, Kohenes metamel mason. A Kohenes, Bas Kohen, could become tamei for mason. Right? She doesn't have an injunction about becoming tamei to the dead. Bein Kohen metamel mason. Also, obviously, a Kohen is not permitted to become tamei mason. Kohen ochal b'kachim. A Kohen is permitted to go. Kohen ochal b'kachei kadoshim. A Kohen is permitted to eat kodesh kachei kadoshim. I'll say kachei kadoshim are karbanos ultimately again of the highest order, which are again chatos, asham, mincha, yet ein kohenes ocheles b'kachei kadoshim. So it's actually very interesting. A kohenes, even a female member of the Kohanic family, does not eat kachei kadoshim. It's very interesting, right? Again, she could eat kachim kalim, she could eat trumas, maestros, but ultimately, again, not kachei kadoshim. So I will say that's ultimately, again, we're going to see it's a pasuk. The pasuk says, kol zochar b'kohanim yochlanu. Pasuk says by kachei kadoshim, it's for male kohanim. Okay, so it's an explicit pasuk. Good. So we'll say that's the next category of the Mishnah. Ma bein ish li isha. So we'll say an interesting discussion over here. What is the difference between a man and woman? A man and woman. And I will say, amazingly enough, the answer is not simply how you identify. Right? So I'll say, so incredible. Incredible. So ma bein ish li isha. What is the difference between a man and woman? obviously, we're talking about halachically over here. Ha'ish pareh parim. So this is actually incredible because this is this week's parsha. This week's parsha, Tazria Mitzorah. So I will say first distinction is in the Mitzorah. Now I will say when a person is stricken with saras, part of their punishment is priya and prima, which means is they have to go ahead and tear their clothing and let their hair grow. Let their hair grow. What I should say is really just the opposite. Poreh means letting your hair grow. Poreh means tearing your clothing. So a man lets his hair grow and goes ahead and tears his clothing. Ve'in ha'isha poras uporemes. And ultimately, again, but a woman does not go ahead and let her hair grow and tear her clothing. Interesting. Ha'ish, again, we'll see that this is really all based on Pesukim. Not real drashas over here, but Pesukim or halachas l'Moshe Misina. We'll go through this list in the Gemara next. Ha'ish madir es beno benazir. We'll say, actually, we had this. A man can make his son, his minor son, into a nazir. Ve'in ha'isha madaris beno benazir. But a woman cannot go ahead and make her son into a nazir. Next, ha'ish megalech on the zero sabib. So ve'in ha'isha megalachas on the zero sabib. So we actually saw this before. You also remember again this case, if let's say you have Yaakov, right? Yaakov and Reuven. Yaakov the father becomes a nazir. Yaakov even set aside his karbanos for the concluding Nazirite rites. Then what happens? Yaakov dies. Well, it just happens to be that Reuven, his son, is also a nazir. Reuven can use his father's karbanos ultimately again for his concluding Nazirite rites. Right? That's what it means. Megaleach al naziros aviv ve'in ha'ish megalachas al naziros aviyah. But a woman ultimately again cannot go ahead and use the karbanos that her father set aside for the concluding Nazirite rites. Incredible. Ha'ish mekadesh es bito. A man could go ahead and marry off his daughter, right? Betroth his daughter. Ve'in ha'isha mekadesh es bita. But a woman cannot go ahead and betroth her daughter. Now, both say, now to point out, remember, there is a concept midrabanan of a mother or a brother marrying off the daughter. But Lamai again, they're talking about da'araisa. So next, so the Gemara says, Aish mocher es bito. A man could sell his daughter, his minor daughter, as an amma, right, as a servant. But a woman cannot do this. Ha'ish, also we just had this last case. Ha'ish niskal arum bein isha niskal arum. A man, if he's stoned, right, put to death, ultimately again is put to death unclothed. Ha'isha ina niskal asaruma. But a woman ultimately again is not put to death unclothed, not stoned unclothed. Ha'ish nitla. Suppose it is a concept that after skila is administered, the body is hanged. So we do this by a man, we do not do this by a woman. Ha'ish nimkar bignevaso. A man is sold by Beis Din in a situation where a person steals and and cannot pay back that which they stole. Ultimately, Beis Din could sell them into servitude in order to work off the debt. This din only applies to a man. Does not apply to women. We'll say a lot in this Mishnah. So let's begin the Gemara. We'll say Gemara Chav Gimel Amud Aleph, about 12 lines up on the bottom. Tanrabanan. Kol nesuos tekuna min chosein esrafa. So we'll say let's begin with this interesting halacha here. So right, we're going out of order a little bit. So he's talking about this idea that if a woman is married to a Kohen and she offers up a carbon mincha, her mincha, we'll say, is totally burnt on the zech. So again, just to be clear, we'll say, so we don't confuse our terminology. We spoke about cases where a mincha cannot be offered up, right? And therefore, again, what do you do with the mincha? You burn it. That's talking about burning it on the base hadeshen, on the ash pile. In other words, burning it because you can't offer it up. When we speak about over here that the mincha of a kohen or the mincha of an eshes kohen is burnt, what we mean is like this. It's offered, the kamitza is offered, but as opposed to a regular mincha, where the kohen eats the leftovers, here, the leftovers themselves are burnt on the mizbeach. That's what it means by nisrafes. So the Gemara says, what's the case of where a woman is married to a kohen, and her mincha is burned? Ketzad, kohenes levia v'Yisraelis. She says the kohen. She will say whoever the woman is, she herself is a kohenes, or she's a levia, or she's Yisraelis. She says the kohen. She marries a kohen. Ein mincha ne'achalas. Her mincha is not eaten, not consumed. Why? Mipnei sheyesh lo chelek ba. Because the Kohen himself ultimately again has a portion. Now we begin to understand. The Torah itself says, minchas, the pasuk is, kol minchas kohen, right? Any mincha of a kohen, this is a pasuk in the Torah. Torah says that a kohen's mincha is burnt on a mizbeach, right? So remember again, meaning the kohen does his kmitza, but he does not get the leftovers of his own carbon. Or for that matter, any carbon in which he has an interest in, he does not get to eat the leftovers. The leftovers are burnt on the mizbeach. So now I understand it. When a wife of a kohen brings a carbon, that is a carbon in which what? He has an interest. Right, literally a financial right. He owns that carbon, right? Right, he owns that carbon. So because of that, when the wife of a kohen brings a carbon, that carbon is treated as if the kohen himself brought it, and therefore after the kmitza, all of the leftovers are burnt on the mizbeach as well. Incredible. Why? So the Gemara says, so rather what happens? So we'll say, so what do we do with the mincha of a kohen, or for that matter, the mincha of a wife of a kohen? Ultimately, again, you go ahead and you offer up the kmitza, v'shirayim karevin ba'atzman, and ultimately the shirayim ultimately again are offered up by themselves. So we'll say it's not the pshat that we burn the entire carbon mincha on the mizbeach. Rather, we take the kometz, the kmitza, offer that up, and then we offer up the leftovers separately. To which the Gemara says, here's the problem. Ikri kan kol shumen li'ishim harei ba'al taktiro. But 1 second, I will say, here's the problem. In general, when you have a carbon where part of it is supposed to be offered up on the mizbeach, there's a biblical prohibition to offer up the rest of it on the mizbeach. In other words, I would say carbonos have a structure. And what's the structure of carbonos? Part of it is offered up on the mizbeach, and part of it is consumed. So if you have a carbon where ultimately part of it is offered up and part of it is consumed, you can't just put stuff on the mizbeach that's unsanctioned. So the Gemara says, I don't understand. The way a carbon mincha works is the kmitza is burned, the rest is consumed. So how are you just able to offer up the rest of it? What's the mechanics of that? To which the Gemara says, you're right. When you burn the rest of the mincha, you're not burning it l'shem carbon. What's your carbon? What are you burning it as? Wood. Wood for the pyre of the mizbeach. That's your kavana. So the Gemara says, the sign Rabbi Elazar Omer, l'reach nichoach iatamala aval atamala l'shemetzim. So Rabbi Elazar says that sometimes when you have to bring a carbon, or you have to offer something up on the mizbeach, but you can't offer it up because the central part of the carbon has already been offered up. The way to kind of get around that is to put it on the mizbeach not for the carbon, but rather l'shum eitzim. So therefore, I will say when you have to burn the remainder of this mincha, but you can't burn it as a carbon because the carbonic part has already been burnt, i.e., the kmitza, offered up or put it on the mizbeach for the sake of firewood. Okay, so honey, the Rabbi Elazar the islay high svara. That's fine if you buy into this. Al Rabbanan the less high svara, my amarle. So we'll say according to Elazar, but according to the Rabbanan who don't buy into this logic that you could offer it up with shemetzim. So what would they do? The Avdilei Rabbi Elazar of Shimon, the sign of Elazar of Shimon Omer, Hakometz karba atzmo, v'hashirayim mispazim abeis hadeshen. Ooh, this is quite fascinating, I will say. They say, you're right, I will say. Again, what do you do in this case? And what do you do in the case of the mincha of a kohen or the mincha of the wife of a kohen? You offer up the kmitza on the mizbeach, and I will say, in fact, the leftovers are not burnt on the mizbeach. Because you will say, why can't they be burnt on the mizbeach? Because again, the halacha is, when you have a carbon that has a core part of it that is supposed to be burnt on the mizbeach, you can't just throw other stuff on the mizbeach. So a mincha, the kmitza goes on the mizbeach. That's it. Once the kmitza goes on the mizbeach, you can't put anything else on the mizbeach. But yet at the same time, the kohen can't eat the leftovers. So what do? So the Rabbanan, so we'll say, so again, we have two possibilities. So Rabbi Elazar says, no problem. Put it on the mizbeach, but not as a carbon. Rather, put it on the mizbeach as what? As what? Firewood. Rabbanan don't buy into that. So they say, no. What do you do with the leftovers? Beis hadeshan, the ash heap. You do not burn it on the mizbeach proper. Rather, you go ahead and you burn it on the ash heap. On the base, Rabbi Shimon, Furthermore, again, I will say, even the Rabbanon, right, don't argue on Rabbi Lazar, except in the case of a minchas chote, right? Because in the case of a minchas chote, ultimately, again, that is fully burnt on the mizbeach. Aval baha, but in this case over here, the mincha of an Eshes coin, afilu Rabbanon modu, right? Even the Rabbanon ultimately, again, would agree that Allah Lamaisa, ultimately, again, even Rabbanan would agree that Allah Lamaisa, you would go ahead and burn the komets, ultimately, again, on the Mizbeach, and the rest done on the Beis Hadeshen. Rabbi say, I will point out over here, this is how the Rabban Paskins. The Rabban Paskins is like the position of the Rabbanon, and that when you have the mincha of a Kohen, when you have mincha, or the mincha of an Eshes Kohen, what ends up, it's fascinating, what ends up happening is, the kamisa is offered up on the Mizbeach, and the rest of it ultimately again is burned on the Beis Hadeshen. Why? Because you run into a technical issue that once you go ahead and you have a carbon that is offered up on the Mizbeach, or pieces offered on the Mizbeach, you can't just throw other stuff onto the Mizbeach. And the notion of putting it on the Shum Eitzim, again, there's a better svar, there's a better way to deal with it. Put it on the Beis Hadeshen. Incredible. Let's go weiter. Bas Yisrael Nesua. So we'll say my timer. So we'll say, so remember again, we said before that if a Bas Yisrael is married to a Kohen, ultimately again, her mincha is burnt. We'll say, Chaf Gimel Amud Beis 23b, 4 lines down. My timer, Amakra, the Chol Minchas Kohen Kodol Tia, Lo Sochal, Kohen Velo Kohanes. So we'll say, so remember again, why? So I'm sorry. Let me go back for just a second. If you have a Kohanes, for example, is married to a Yisrael, what's the status of her? What's the status of her mincha? What's the status of her mincha? Regular mincha. Why? Says the Gemara, Damar Kra v'chol minchas Kohen kadol tielo sochal Kohen v'lo kohenes. Because we'll say the pasuk explicitly says the only type of mincha that can't be consumed is what type of mincha? Kol minchas Kohen. It only applies to a Kohen and not to a Kohenes. So I will say, so remember again, the only types of carbon mincha that have to be totally burnt is either the mincha of a Kohen or who else? The mincha of the wife of a Kohen. Now I will say, and even then why? Because effectively the mincha of the wife of a Kohen is the mincha of who? Of the Kohen himself. So therefore again, the halacha doesn't only apply to a Kohen and would not apply to a Kohenes who marries a Yisrael, for example. Beautiful. Next. Kohenes mischaleles Kohen in mischala. So remember again, we said before that a Kohenes, right? The Kohenes, she could become a mischala. So what that means, she could become permanently disqualified from the kahuna. For example, let's say she has relations with someone whom she cannot marry. Ultimately, again, I will say that renders her unfit in perpetuity to go ahead and marry a Kohen. Conversely, a Kohen goes ahead and marries someone he's not allowed to. We'll say, what happens? What happens? There's a temporary disqualification. As long as he is part of this illegal marriage, he cannot serve as a Kohen. Remove the illegal marriage, he's restored to his kahuna. So the Gemara says, Minavan, how do you know that distinction? Damakra v'lo yechalel zar'o bi'amov. Because we'll say the pasuk is actually fascinating. The pasuk, when speaking about again the illegal marriages of a Kohen, says, Kohen, don't do this. Why? Because if he does so, lo yichalal zar lamav, he should not profane his offspring. We'll say, so what do you see from here? Zara mischalal, voina mischalal. His offspring becomes permanently disqualified, but yet the Kohen himself never becomes permanently disqualified. I will say it's really a fascinating idea, which is that what? So for example, if a Kohen marries a grusha, marries a divorcee, they have children. I will say, what do we call those children? No, we call those children Yidden, right? So that's number one, right? They're Jews, and we love them, and we love every single Jew. It happens to be they have a genealogical issue called chalalos. And I will say, can you remove chalalos? So remember again, technically you can. Chalalos doesn't, there are ways, in other words, it doesn't necessarily have to be passed on and on. But Lamaisa, for those kids themselves, they have a status. So it's fascinating, I will say, it's fascinating. The father, the Kohen, who's the one who committed the Avera, his status is not permanent. So in other words, let's say again, things don't work out with Mrs. Grusha, right? So let's say, so what's the halacha now? Again, they get divorced. So what's his status now? We'll say, what's his status? Right? he rolls back into the Beis Hamikdash the next morning, right? And again, he's restored back to his sense. So it's fascinating. Again, the Torah says, Lo yichalel zar'o, right? So the offspring has a permanent genealogical disqualification. The Kohen himself, I will say, but just as an aside, very, very quickly, why? Right? It seems to be so unfair that the Kohen himself, who is one who committed the Avera. So again, I want to point out, what do you get from marrying a Grusha? I don't know, that sounded wrong, right? In other words, for a Kohen, right? What does a Kohen get from marrying a Grusha? What does he get? So say first again, there's Malchus, because he's violated Lav Daraisa. He's also ostracized from the Kohanic community, and there are a lot of ramifications. But yet, the moment he steps away from this marriage, he's pretty much restored to full Kohanic rights and privilege, right? But his kids are left holding the bag. So I say, what's the pshat? Maybe the pshat is like this. Sefer HaChinuch brings down by the mitzvah Aliyah L'Regel. It says, why is there a mitzvah to go to the Beis Mishkot to Yerushalayim 3 times a year? Why? He says, because we want the Jewish people to go to see the Mikdash. But specifically, he says, we want them to see Kohanim. Right? Kohanim represent the paradigm of what a Jew is supposed to be. Right? An individual who forges a meaningful and unique relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. A person who is the Shliach Hashem and the Shliach of Klal Yisrael. He's both. A Kohen, if he does his job correctly, looks like the paradigmatic image of a Jew. Shabbos say, if that's the case, then perhaps what the Torah is trying to teach us is Sotah. If that's the case, it's supposed to be the paradigm. We'll say one of the most important lessons a Jew has to learn is, no matter how badly you mess up in life, there is always a way back home. No matter how many wrong turns you make, there's always a way back home. And I will say, the Kohen, who is the paradigmatic Rebbe for Klal Yisrael, has to be able to teach that lesson. So I will say, if he were to marry a Grusha and forever be disqualified, what's the message I get when I come to the Beis Hamikdash? That there are some mistakes in life that you can't recover from. And that's not the lesson to learn. Are there some mistakes you can't recover from? There are some mistakes you can't fully recover from. But tshuva is always possible, no matter how heinous or how grievous the act may be. And I need the Kohen to be able to teach me that. So perhaps HaKadosh Baruch Hu structures it, that as unfair as it looks, right? I need the Kohen to be able to become a full Baal Tshuva. I the Yisrael, I need that. Because I need to be able to go to Beis Hamikdash. I need to be able to see someone who makes a bad mistake in life and can still fully recover. Because if I see that, then it inspires me to do the same. Perhaps, that's why HaKadosh Baruch Hu structured it this way. That looks unfair. The father who committed the Aveira can totally recover. The kids who are innocent bystanders are kind of left with this genealogical blemish. But for the sake of Klal Yisrael, we need the Kohen to be able to become a complete and unequivocal Baal Tshuva, so he can inspire us to do the same. Let's go back there. Kohenes Metama. So we'll say Kohenes could go ahead and become Tameah. Right? Kohen cannot. My time Amakra, and more like Kohen Bnei Aaron. Bnei Aaron, so let's say a pasuk. Just a pasuk. Right? Ultimately, again, Bnei Aaron, they can't become Tameh, but Benos Aaron can. You will say that's halakha l'maisa, right? In other words, an Eishes Kohen, a Kohenes, they can go to a Levaya, right? But ultimately, again, a Kohen cannot. Kohen ochal b'kachei kadashim. A Kohen, bless you. Kohen ultimately, again, kiri kachei kadashim. T'chsev kol zachar b'bnei Aaron yochleram. As we saw before, again, so sons, right? Sons could go ahead. Sons could go, or Kohanim themselves kiri kachei kadashim. Women cannot. Kohanos cannot. Uma bein ish. So again, in general, we saw, what's the difference between a man and a woman? So remember, first distinction was by mitzora, right? A male mitzora has to let his hair grow and rend his garments. A woman does not. So tzara banon ish, emi ela ish, ish shemenai kishu omer, vatsaru ashebo, hare kan shnayim. Im kein ma tamud lomar ish. So what's I say? So why does the pasuk point out ish by the mitzora? To which the Gemara says, To Elamai Tamlomar Ish, Le'in Shalamata, Ish Pores. We'll say ultimately again to teach us to refer ultimately again to the matter below, namely that a man goes, it was just starting the psukim. So a male mitzvah has an obligation to rent his garments and to let his hair grow, but ultimately again a woman does not. Ha'ish Madir es beno benazir ve'ina isha madar es beno benazir. Next, a woman, a man could go ahead and make his son into a nazir. Again, remember a minor son. Into a nazir, a woman cannot. I'm Rabbi Yochanan, halachi benazir. We will say halacha l'Moshe Sinai. Halacha l'Moshe Sinai. Ha'ish megalech on the ziros aviv, ve'ina isha megalechas on the ziros aviyah. So to again, a man could use the Nazirite karbanos of his now deceased father, but a woman cannot. I'm Rabbi Yochanan, halacha hi benazir. Halacha l'Moshe Sinai. Okay, Ha'ish mekadesh es bita ve'ena ish mekadesh es bita. A man could marry off his minor daughter. A woman cannot. D'chsev es biti nasati la'ish hazeh. I have given my daughter, again, phrase from the father, and right, the Rebbe says actually by the Motzi Shemra, right? I've given my daughter to this man. So again, clearly it's a right that a father has, a mother does not. Ha'ish mochar es bita ve'ena ish mochar es bita. A man could sell his daughter as a maidservant. A woman cannot. D'chsev ki yimkar ish as bito. Okay, pretty explicit pasuk. If a man will sell his daughter, ha'ish niskal arum, a man, I will say, if he's stoned, executed by stoning, is stoned ultimately unclothed. A woman is not. So my taima v'ragmu oso. The pasuk says they will stone him. My oso. What does oso mean? Ilema oso v'lo osa. If you say maybe it means that only a man is stoned and a woman is not. Vaksiv v'otzei says ha'ishahu o ha'ishahi. Can't be able to say because the pasuk explicitly says they could take out this man or this woman. Ella oso below kisuso. Rather, it means again him without his clothing. Velo osa below kisusa. So I'll say ultimately again it means that also oso is very interesting. So oso means, what actually oso means, you stone him. Him means him and only him. Meaning what? Him without his clothing, right? So that lashon ultimately again is not used by a woman herself. Incredible. So ultimately again a man is hanged after being stoned. So my time amakra vitalisa oso al ha'etz oso v'lo osa. We'll say same idea again. It says here, it says him and not her. So we'll say just a series of psukim. Next, ha'ish nimkar bignei vaso ve'ina isha nimkares bignei vaso. Ultimately, again, a man is sold as a result of his theft, but a woman is not sold as a result of it. So just to be clear, this case is about a case of a person who steals something, doesn't have the ability to repay that which they have stolen. The Torah provides a mechanism of evet ivri. The Beis Din sells the person into servitude to effectively work off their debt. So a man is sold and a woman is not sold. My time amakra v'nim karbin gneva so. Bigneva so, below bigneva so. So the pasuk says he is sold in his gneva, right? His theft, right? His theft, and ultimately again not her theft. We'll say shkoyach hadron Allah chayenotel. What about that? What a way to start the new month, finishing up a new parak. Absolutely incredible. We'll say shkoyach. Beautiful, beautiful Mazel Tov, a good Chodesh, a good Erev Shabbos. All right, so we don't have time for a parsha advice, but I'll record something a little bit later. Let's say shkoyach. Good Shabbos, good Shabbos. Jason is at 7.
First differentiation between each